Hey everyone, welcome back to Speak Up, the podcast where we dive deep into practical tips that help you improve your English in a way that feels natural. I'm Ryan, your host, and today we've got a super important topic that I know a lot of you have been asking for: how to think in English. This is such a game changer if you're learning English as a second language. You know how it goes. Sometimes you get stuck in your head trying to translate everything from your native language, right? It slows you down, makes you feel less confident. Well, today, we're going to show you how to stop that. Instead of translating, you'll learn how to think directly in English, which makes speaking a whole lot easier and more natural. But before we jump in, let me introduce my co-host, Priya. She's been through this exact process and has some awesome insights to share. Priya, how's it going?
Thanks, Ryan. Hey everyone! I'm so excited about today's episode because, honestly, thinking in English was one of the biggest challenges I faced when I started learning. I remember how frustrating it was to constantly translate everything from Hindi to English in my head. It felt like I could never just speak without second-guessing myself. But once I figured out how to switch my thinking to English, everything changed. My sentences flowed better, and I didn't feel that panic when someone asked me a question in English. It just became more natural. So here's what we'll be talking about today. First, we're going to cover why it's so important to think in English and how it can completely transform how you speak. Then, we'll dive into some practical, easy-to-follow steps that you can start using right away. And don't worry, these aren't complicated strategies. You can start using them today, even if your English is still improving. We'll share our personal tips, examples, and challenges we faced. And by the end of this episode, you'll be ready to start rewiring your brain to think directly in English.
Exactly. This is going to be super actionable. Whether you're a beginner or you've been learning English for a while, these tips will work for you. So stick with us, because by the end of this episode, you'll have some great tools to help you stop translating and start thinking in English like a natural speaker. Ready to dive in? All right. So now that we're all set, let's start by talking about why thinking in English is such a big deal. You might be wondering, why can't I just keep translating in my head? Isn't that working for me so far? Well, here's the thing. When you're constantly translating from your native language, you're adding an extra step to every sentence. And that extra step slows you down, makes you hesitate, and sometimes even leads to mistakes because different languages have different structures and expressions. Plus, it takes up a lot of mental energy, right? I remember when I was learning Spanish, I'd freeze up mid-conversation because I was busy trying to translate a sentence perfectly in my head. It wasn't until I started thinking directly in Spanish, just like we're talking about here with English, that I could really keep up with conversations without feeling overwhelmed.
Exactly, Ryan. And it's not just about speed. When you're translating, you're not really engaging with English as a language, right? It always feels a bit distant, like you're just passing it through a filter. I went through the same thing when I was learning English. I would hear something in English, translate it to Hindi in my head, then think of my response in Hindi, and then translate it back to English. It was exhausting. And it made me feel so unsure of myself, like I wasn't truly speaking English. But when I shifted to thinking directly in English, it was like a weight lifted. I wasn't worried about perfect translations anymore. My sentences might not have been flawless at first, but they were mine. I was speaking English from my thoughts, not from a translation in my head.
Yeah, and that's such a key point. When you think directly in English, it's not just faster, it's more authentic. You stop being so hard on yourself about getting every word right because you're no longer stuck in that back and forth of translating. And let's be real, languages don't translate perfectly. There are idioms, phrases, even emotions that just don't come across the same way. So, thinking in English helps you stay in the flow of the conversation without getting caught up in those little details. And here's why it matters to you, listening right now. You're probably already doing a great job studying vocabulary, maybe practicing speaking, but if you're still translating, that could be holding you back from reaching the next level of fluency. By thinking directly in English, you can respond faster, feel more confident, and sound more natural in conversations.
Exactly. Let me give you a quick example from my own experience. When I first started thinking in English, I was a bit scared because I thought I'd forget words or get stuck. But I realized it's okay if I don't know every word or phrase. I was still able to communicate what I wanted to say. And over time, I got better at it. I'd catch myself thinking, "Oh, I need to buy some groceries," instead of translating it from Hindi. Little shifts like that made a huge difference. So, for our listeners, the takeaway is, stop worrying about perfect grammar or translation. The goal is to get your brain used to processing English naturally. It doesn't happen overnight, but the more you practice, the easier it gets.
That's right, Priya. And remember, this isn't about speaking flawlessly from day one. It's about building that muscle of thinking directly in English. As Priya said, the small shifts, like catching yourself thinking in English even during simple tasks, are what lead to big changes. Leading into the next segment. Now that we've covered why this is so important, let's get into the really practical stuff. How do you actually start doing this? How can you train yourself to think in English? We've got some great tips that you can start using today. All right, let's get to the part everyone's been waiting for. The actual steps you can take to start thinking in English. This isn't something that happens overnight, but with consistent practice, you'll notice that your brain starts making that switch. And the best part? You don't need to set aside hours every day to do this. These are things you can work into your daily life, starting right now. So, let's kick it off with something simple but effective. Labeling your everyday thoughts in English. And I mean literally everything. Whatever you're doing, wherever you are. Priya, you've done this yourself, right?
Yeah, this one's a game changer. It sounds almost too simple, but it really works. Here's how it goes. As you go about your day, just label the things around you in English. Let's say you're in your bedroom. Instead of thinking B* for bed, say bed in your mind. If you're heading out the door, instead of thinking chapel for slippers, think shoes or slippers in English. Every little thing you encounter, whether it's a mirror, a car, or lunch, you start naming in English. I remember doing this for a full day, and by the end of it, my brain started reaching for English words automatically. And trust me, it doesn't matter if your vocabulary is basic at first. Even if all you know are simple words like phone, keys, or bag, that's enough to get you started.
Exactly. You don't need complex sentences to begin with. Start small, just single words, then move on to short phrases. For example, if you're about to grab your coffee in the morning, instead of thinking, "I need to make coffee" in your native language, you say in your head, "I'm making coffee." Even though it's basic, it's effective because you're getting your brain used to processing English without the extra translation step. And here's a quick challenge for all our listeners. As you're listening to this podcast, look around you and start naming things in English. Phone, table, notebook, water bottle. Do it right now. This small exercise makes your brain more comfortable with everyday English.
Yes. And another great thing you can do once you're comfortable with words is to expand into simple sentences. Start describing what you're doing in English. So instead of just thinking phone, you could say, "I'm checking my phone." If you're walking outside, think, "I'm going for a walk," or "It's sunny today." These are thoughts you already have throughout the day, so why not shift them into English? When I first did this, it felt a little awkward, like my brain was slowing down to process in English. But after a few days of sticking to it, those simple sentences became easier. And the more I did it, the faster my brain started thinking in English naturally.
That's the key right there, consistency. At first, it might feel slow or even frustrating, but that's just your brain rewiring itself. Every time you practice, you're building up that ability to think faster in English. And speaking of thinking faster, let's move on to our next tip, asking yourself questions in English. This one's all about getting your brain into the habit of thinking in English through self-dialogue. We all ask ourselves little questions during the day like, "Where are my keys?" or "What should I eat for lunch?" Instead of asking those questions in your native language, switch it up and ask them in English. Like, "What am I going to wear today?" or "What time is it?" It's a great way to practice without needing anyone else around.
Exactly. I used to do this all the time when I started practicing English. When I was getting ready in the morning, instead of thinking, "Mujhe kya pehenna chahiye?" I'd ask, "What should I wear?" At first, I wasn't answering out loud, just thinking it in my head. But after a while, I found myself starting to answer in English too. It was like having a mini conversation with myself. This trick is so helpful because it forces you to engage with English on a deeper level. You're not just labeling things, you're actually interacting with the language in a more conversational way. And it works whether you're at home, at work, or even out shopping. Try asking yourself things like, "Do I need to buy anything?" Or, "How do I get to the train station?" The more you do it, the more natural it becomes.
That's a great point, Priya. So here's another challenge for our listeners. Today, pick one question you usually ask yourself, like, "What should I eat?" or "Where did I put that?" And make sure you only ask it in English all day long. It's such a simple shift, but you'll notice it makes a big difference after a while. Now, speaking of self-dialogue, our next tip takes that a step further, using English to describe your emotions. This is a really powerful way to internalize English because emotions are something we all experience every day. Priya, I know this one worked wonders for you.
Oh, absolutely. This one made such a difference for me. Whenever I felt something, whether it was happiness, frustration, or even excitement, I made an effort to describe it in English. So instead of thinking, "Main tak gai hoon" for "I'm tired," I'd think, "I'm so tired right now." Or instead of "Ye kam bahut mushkil hai," I'd say, "This task is really hard." And what's great about this tip is that it helps you personalize your English. You're not just using the language to describe things around you, you're actually connecting it with how you feel. That makes it stick more. So whenever you're feeling happy, sad, stressed, whatever it is, just take a moment to describe it in English. Even if it's just, "I'm feeling excited today," it makes a big impact.
Exactly. Because language isn't just about objects and actions, it's about expressing yourself, right? When you start describing your emotions in English, you're taking it to a deeper level. It makes English feel like a language that's yours, not something distant that you're just trying to use. All right, so let's recap what we've covered so far. First, start by labeling your surroundings in English. Then, move on to forming simple sentences about your daily tasks. Ask yourself questions in English throughout the day, and don't forget to describe your emotions as they come up. These steps will train your brain to stop translating and start thinking directly in English.
Exactly. And remember, these are things you can start doing today. They're easy. They don't take much time. And if you stick with them, you'll see the difference pretty quickly. It's all about consistency and practice. So, ready for the next tip, Ryan? Let's do it.
All right, now that we've covered labeling, asking questions, and describing emotions, let's get into the next step. Using English before you actually speak it. This tip is all about slowing down just a bit before you start talking in English, giving your brain a chance to process and respond in English first. So often, we feel that pressure to answer quickly, and that's when the translation habit kicks in, right? Instead, before you say anything, take a brief moment to think about your response in English. For example, if someone asks you, "What did you do this weekend?" Instead of jumping straight into translating from your native language, pause and think in English. "Okay, I went hiking, I saw a movie, and I had dinner with friends." Just give yourself that extra second to get your thoughts lined up in English before speaking. It makes a huge difference.
Oh, this is a big one for me. When I was learning English, I always felt like I had to respond immediately, and it made me panic. But when I started giving myself permission to pause, even for a second, I could think in English without rushing. And let's be real, nobody notices that slight pause. People actually appreciate when you take a moment to give a thoughtful response. Like if someone asks you, "What's your favorite food?" Instead of thinking in Hindi first and then translating, I'd take a moment and just think, Okay, my favorite food is pizza. By allowing that small pause, I started feeling more confident. It also reduced the pressure because I wasn't stuck translating back and forth. So, my advice? Next time someone asks you a question in English, just pause for a second. You'll be surprised how quickly your brain can start forming thoughts in English once you make it a habit.
Exactly. And here's another benefit of this practice. By taking that small pause, you're also training your brain to trust that it can find the words in English. When you're constantly rushing, it's like telling your brain, "Hey, we don't have time to think in English. We need to switch back to our native language for speed." But with just that 1-second pause, you're giving your brain the space to process in English. And like Priya said, no one notices that tiny break. It's about building that trust and confidence. So here's a challenge for you. Today, when you're speaking to someone in English, take a brief moment to think in English before answering. Even if it's just a split second, it helps you stay in that English mindset.
Yeah, I totally agree, Ryan. And I'll give you guys an example of how this worked for me in real life. I was in a meeting at work, and someone asked me to explain a project I was working on. Now, in the past, I would have panicked and tried to translate everything I wanted to say from Hindi to English. But instead, I took that tiny pause, thought about the key points in English, and then started speaking. It wasn't perfect, but it was clear, and I didn't feel that overwhelming stress of trying to get every word right. So if you feel nervous about answering quickly in English, remember, you're not alone, and it's totally okay to pause and think. It makes speaking feel more natural and relaxed.
Absolutely. And one more thing. That pause doesn't just help you organize your thoughts. It also gives you a moment to choose the right vocabulary, even if it's simple. It doesn't need to be fancy English, just clear, direct, and confident. So, to recap so far, we've talked about labeling your surroundings, asking yourself questions, describing emotions, and now giving yourself that moment to think before speaking. These are all simple steps you can integrate into your day-to-day life. But we're not done yet. The next tip is all about surrounding yourself with English to help keep your mind in English mode all day long. Priya, you want to take this one?
Absolutely. This next tip is one of my favorites because it's something you can do without even thinking too hard. It's about immersing yourself in English as much as possible. Whether it's through TV shows, podcasts, music, or even changing your phone's language to English. The idea here is that the more English you're exposed to, the more natural it becomes for your brain to think in English. For example, I love watching sitcoms like Friends or The Office. They're great because the language is casual, and it's how people actually speak in real life. I'd watch an episode a day, and over time I noticed I started thinking in English phrases I'd heard from the show. I wasn't even trying. It just became part of how my brain processed the language.
That's such a great point, Priya. You don't even have to sit down and study English like a textbook to do this. Just surrounding yourself with it in your downtime makes a huge impact. If you're listening to music, try understanding the lyrics in English. If you're watching YouTube or Netflix, pick something in English and really pay attention to how people are speaking. Don't worry if you don't catch every word. What matters is that you're giving your brain more English input throughout the day. And hey, one small but effective trick. Change your phone's language settings to English. I know it sounds simple, but you're constantly using your phone, right? Seeing all your apps and notifications in English keeps your brain in that English zone without even thinking about it.
Yes, I did that too, and it really helps. You start getting used to seeing words and commands in English without even realizing it. And it's those little moments like checking your messages or setting an alarm that start to add up. It's like training your brain in the background while you go about your normal day. I remember when I switched my phone's language to English, even the small things, like reading notifications or checking the weather, became little English lessons. It was so helpful because I didn't feel like I was studying, but my brain was still working in English all the time.
Exactly. So for everyone listening, here's another challenge. Today, pick one form of media, whether it's a TV show, a podcast, or your favorite music, and immerse yourself in it in English for at least 15 to 20 minutes. It doesn't have to be complicated, and you don't have to understand everything, but just expose your brain to more English. And if you're feeling adventurous, go ahead and switch your phone to English too. It's a small but powerful shift.
Totally. You'll be surprised at how quickly your brain starts getting used to it. And like we said, it's not about being perfect. It's about surrounding yourself with as much English as possible so it becomes second nature. So, we've covered a lot so far. Labeling your thoughts, asking yourself questions, describing your emotions, pausing before speaking, and immersing yourself in English content. But there's one more tip we want to share that's really going to bring it all together. Writing your thoughts in English. Ready for that one, Ryan?
Let's dive into it. All right, this last tip is a powerful one, and it's something you can start doing right away, writing your thoughts in English. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking, I'm not a writer, or I don't have time to sit down and write paragraphs in English. But that's not what we're talking about here. This is a simple, practical way to train your brain to think in English. Here's how it works. Each day, take a few minutes to write down your thoughts or even your to-do list in English. You don't have to write anything fancy. Just focus on expressing whatever's on your mind, even if it's just 1 or 2 sentences. For example, today I need to go grocery shopping, or I'm excited about the weekend. By writing it down, you're giving your brain another way to process thoughts in English.
Exactly. And writing doesn't need to be intimidating. When I started doing this, I kept it super simple. I used to just write down what I planned to do for the day in English, like finish my project or call my friend. It was short and quick, but the more I did it, the more comfortable I became with thinking in English naturally. I remember one day I had a lot going on at work, so I started writing down my task list in English. Prepare for the meeting, send the report, grab lunch with colleagues. These were small steps, but they forced my brain to organize everything in English. After a few weeks, I noticed that even when I wasn't writing, I was thinking about my day in English first. It became automatic.
That's the key right there, making it automatic. The more you write, even if it's just a couple of lines a day, the more you train your brain to naturally think in English without the need to translate. And like you said, it doesn't have to be a full diary entry. You can start with something as simple as jotting down your daily to-do list or a few sentences about how your day went. Here's a super easy way to start. Tonight, before you go to bed, grab your phone or a notebook and write down 2 or 3 things that happened during your day. It could be as basic as, I worked on a project, or I met a friend for coffee. The goal is to get comfortable with forming sentences in English. And if you do this consistently, you'll notice your mind starts thinking in English more often, even when you're not writing.
Yes. And you know what? Let's turn this into a challenge for our listeners. For the next week, we challenge you to write down at least 3 sentences in English every day. It doesn't matter what they're about. Maybe it's what you did, something you're looking forward to, or even just what you ate for dinner. Just write it down in English and watch how it starts to change the way you think. And here's a tip. Don't worry about making it perfect. When I started doing this, my sentences weren't always grammatically correct, and that's okay. The point is to train your brain to start thinking and expressing in English without getting stuck on perfection. So, let go of that pressure and just write whatever comes to mind.
Exactly, Priya. This is all about progress, not perfection. The more you practice, the better you'll get, and your brain will start making those connections in English faster. So, to everyone listening, make sure you take on this writing challenge with us. You'll be surprised at how much it helps with your overall fluency and confidence. To quickly recap, we've talked about labeling your surroundings in English, asking yourself questions, describing your emotions, pausing before speaking, immersing yourself in English content, and now writing your thoughts down in English. Each of these steps builds on the last and helps train your brain to think directly in English, making the process smoother and more natural over time.
Absolutely. These tips are all about getting your brain used to English in different ways, and the more you incorporate them into your daily life, the more automatic it becomes. And don't forget, none of this has to feel like a chore. You can fit these practices into your routine in a way that feels natural. The idea is to make thinking in English a habit that just happens throughout your day.
Exactly. And remember, these are steps you can start using right now. You don't need a classroom, you don't need extra time. Just incorporate these tips into your normal routine, and before you know it, you'll be thinking in English more and more. So, that brings us to the end of our practical tips section. Priya, I think it's time we talk about some of the challenges people might face when trying to think in English and how they can overcome them. All right, now that we've covered all these awesome tips, let's get real for a second. Thinking in English doesn't happen overnight, and there are definitely some challenges along the way. It's totally normal to feel stuck, frustrated, or even a little overwhelmed at first. So let's talk about some of those common challenges and, more importantly, how to overcome them. Priya, I know you've been through this yourself, so let's start with one of the biggest challenges people face, feeling like their brain is slowing down when they try to think in English. It's that mental block, right? How did you deal with that?
Oh yes, I've definitely been there. At first, whenever I tried to think in English, it felt like my brain was moving in slow motion. I'd start a sentence in my head, and then freeze because I didn't know the right word, or the grammar felt too complicated. It's like my mind was used to the comfort of thinking in Hindi, and English was this foreign thing that slowed everything down. But here's what I realized. That slow feeling is totally normal. It's a sign that your brain is doing the work to make those new connections in English. It doesn't mean you're failing. It means you're making progress. The trick is to be patient with yourself. For example, if you're stuck on a word, don't stress about it. Either try to describe what you mean with simpler words or just keep going, even if it feels a bit awkward at first. Over time, that slow feeling fades as your brain gets better at processing English.
Exactly. It's all about building those connections, and it's important to remember that your brain is essentially learning a new way to operate, so it's going to feel a little slow at first. Just like when you're learning a new skill, whether it's playing an instrument, learning to cook, or even driving a car, it takes practice and repetition before it feels natural. My tip here is to embrace that slowness. Don't see it as a problem. See it as part of the process. If you feel stuck, go back to using simpler sentences, or even use phrases you already know. The key is to keep thinking in English, even if it's at a slower pace, because every time you do, you're reinforcing those mental pathways.
Absolutely. And another challenge I hear from a lot of people is the fear of making mistakes. They worry that if they think in English, they'll think wrong or use incorrect grammar, and that stops them from even trying. I used to feel that way too, but here's the thing. Mistakes are part of the process. You're not going to get it perfect every time, and that's okay. I remember once I was thinking in English about a conversation I had with a friend, and I realized I used the wrong tense in my head. But instead of getting frustrated, I just corrected myself, like, okay, next time I'll use the past tense here. It was a learning moment, not a failure. So, for anyone listening who's worried about making mistakes, I'd say, let go of that fear. Mistakes are how you improve. The more you make, the more you learn. And the best part is, no one can hear the mistakes you make in your own head. You get to practice in a safe space.
Exactly, Priya. That's such an important mindset shift. Seeing mistakes as learning opportunities instead of something to avoid. And the more you let go of that fear, the faster your progress will be. It's okay if your thoughts aren't perfect. The goal is progress, not perfection. Now, another challenge people face is frustration when they hit a language block. You know that feeling when you just can't find the right word or your brain seems to freeze up mid-thought? It can be super frustrating, but what I found helpful is to keep pushing through, even when the right word doesn't come to mind. For example, if you're thinking about something and get stuck, try using simpler words or rephrase what you're thinking. If you can't remember the word bicycle, maybe you say the thing you ride to work. The idea is to keep going in English, even if you have to work around certain words. This keeps you thinking in English, and eventually those blocks become less frequent.
Exactly. And here's another little trick that worked for me. If I got stuck on a word or a phrase, I'd try to visualize it. Our brains are really good at connecting images to language. So if you can't think of the word for apple, just picture an apple in your mind while thinking in English. It helps keep you in English mode without feeling like you're failing. And remember, language blocks happen to everyone, even native speakers. The important thing is not to get discouraged. Like Ryan said, find ways around it. Simplify your thoughts, use descriptions, or even take a deep breath and reset. You'll get there with time and patience.
That's such a great point, Priya. The key takeaway here is that thinking in English is a process, and challenges are a normal part of that process. Whether it's feeling slow, making mistakes, or hitting language blocks, these are just steps on the path to fluency. Don't let them stop you from moving forward. So, to all our listeners, if you're facing any of these challenges, just know that it's completely normal. Keep practicing, keep thinking in English. And remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about making progress every day.
You're doing great. Keep going. Every challenge brings you closer to thinking in English naturally. Let's recap. Thinking in English helps you speak naturally and respond faster. We discussed practical tips like labeling, asking questions, describing emotions, pausing, immersing yourself, and writing. Remember, it's normal to feel slow or frustrated at first. Be patient, push through, and remember mistakes are part of learning.
The big takeaway is that thinking in English takes practice. Make it a part of your daily life. Start with 1 or 2 tips and build from there. Consistency is key. If you feel stuck, come back to this episode and keep going. You're making progress just by trying. Our challenge for you: over the next week, pick 1 tip and focus on it. Share your progress with us. We love hearing from you and supporting you on your journey to thinking and speaking in English.
Let us know what tip you're trying out and how it's working. Don't be shy about sharing challenges. We're all in this together. That's it for today's episode of Speak Up. Thanks for joining us. Remember, every little step gets you closer to fluency. Keep practicing, stay consistent, and have fun with it. We'll be back next time with more tips. Thanks for listening. We're proud of you for taking these steps. Until next time, keep thinking, speaking, and growing in English. Bye for now.